on a cold, dark winter's night. On the Upper West Side of Manhattan, New York City, one man is about to make a fateful decision that will change the world forever. It is December 8th, 1980. 10:50 p.m. The most famous musician in the world steps out of his limousine, holding his wife's hand. Oblivious, he takes what are about to be his final steps. In a whimper, a cowardly voice calls out to him. A madman with a gun, a sad, self-indulgent loner, takes aim and fires 5 times.
It doesn't matter about people not liking our records or not liking the way we look or what we say. You know, they're entitled to not like us, and we're entitled not to have anything to do with them if we don't want to, or not to regard them. You know, we've all got our rights, you know. Harold.
Ladies and gentlemen, they will be here soon. They're ready for you. Are you ready for them?
After a tumultuous opening concert last night, hundreds of fans have been crowding around the group's hotel today, shouting, "We want the Beatles."
When the quartet with hair like unmade beds arrive in the Netherlands, it's the same story as in Britain and the U.S. People who value their sanity head for cover and let the teenagers take over. New York City cops are hard-pressed protecting the Beatles at their hotel. On every side, there is hero worship that recalls the heydays of Elvis Presley and Frank Sinatra. With one Beatle bedded with a sore throat, 3 of the quartet take an airing in Central Park. There was absolutely no truth to the rumor that the Zoo's laughing hyena was driven underground. Variety clubs of Britain had little trouble picking this year's showbiz personalities. They needed to look no further than the nearest transistor radios. So at the State Dorchester Hotel, where crowned heads have often been dined, 4 crown princes receive an accolade from the show world's charitable organization. And we hardly need to mention that they need no charity except from exasperated parents.
I'd just like to say the same as the others. Thanks for the Purple Hearts.
In only a matter of years, John Lennon went from the Beatles' pop superstar to a political activist, known for his songs about peace and love around the world. His change in persona allowed him to stand out on his own, and because of it, helped him to become one of the most idolized figures of his generation.
We could possibly do events here.
Yes.
More events here, yes. Everywhere where we can spread the word, please, you know.
And we felt that Amsterdam was a very important place to do it, because the thing is, it has a very fresh and alive interest, Amsterdam, for the...
and the plovers and the white bicycles.
World peace, etc. And this is for the world peace, you see.
Yes.
And we're thinking that instead of going out and fight and make war or something like that, we should just stay in bed. Everybody should just stay in bed and enjoy the spring, you know.
Lennon's outspoken comments about peace and equality started to become a threat to the American establishment. 6 months after moving to the country to start a new chapter of his life, Lennon was threatened with deportation.
He was an anti-establishment figure in the United States. He was seen as hugely influential. He'd galvanized support against the Vietnam War. He was seen as somebody that the FBI wanted out of the country, and in fact, at one point, he was asked to leave the country. So this was a man who was not wanted in America at all. They wanted him out.
John, why are you being deported?
Well, the sort of official reason is something about we overstayed, both of us, so that's reason enough to throw us out. The other official reason is that I was busted in England for pot. And the real reason is because I'm a peacenik.
Well, there was a movement in the mid-'70s by forces in the Nixon administration, egged on by South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond of the Republican Party, to get John Lennon deported. And the reason wasn't just that Strom Thurmond is an arch-conservative, an ex-segregationist from the 40s and the 50s. You know, a pretty nasty piece of work, Mr. Thurmond. Senator Thurmond was alerting his friend Richard Nixon in the White House to this John Lennon guy because they were afraid, their specific fear was they were afraid that John Lennon would lead some kind of disturbance or peace movement thing at the Republican National Convention that would somehow disrupt things or shift the nation's young people into the Democratic Party fold. So early on, when Lennon was wanted to come to live in New York, there was quite a hoo-ha about it, and he had a court case once he was living in New York to defend his right to get a green card that lasted years, actually, because Senator Thurmond was telling President Nixon, look, this guy has the ear of the nation's youth, and if he's sort of dormant now as a political guy. He's not quite what he was. But if he comes to light at any particular time, and he comes out for a Democratic candidate or just an anti-war platform, we could be in trouble.
John had to fight to get here. John had to fight to actually be accepted here. And he knew that. And he also knew that it was very important at this time that he would be here. Because already the seed of violence and hatred was happening. And he thought that we have to really do something about that.
It obsessed him. And it made him just happy nervous. I'm sure he got a great deal done anyway, but it's kind of like being in a court case. It's sort of like being hunted by the cops, since that's in fact what they were doing, where they were invading his privacy, trying to follow him, tap his phone, all the, against the Fourth Amendment stuff. Well, why, you wonder? Well, why? Because he was extremely effective spokesperson for the peace movement.
One is bed piece, but they normally spell P-I-E-C, but it's a pun. And hair piece. Bed piece is we're going to stay in bed for 7 days, sort of, instead of having a private honeymoon. It's a private protest.
For the violence that's going in the world, you see.
To say,
we feel that instead of making war, it's better to just stay in bed. Let's stay in bed for the spring.
And grow your hair.
Yes.
For peace. Let it grow till peace comes, you know.
So this is part of your honeymoon?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
How are you enjoying married life?
It's beautiful, you know. It's beautiful.
Some of the things people have said about you, I haven't been very kind.
No.
Lately.
No.
Does this get you down?
Well, it's so much that it got past being depressing. It's got into a joke again. You know? It was a bit depressing the way they kept picking on Yoko, you know, and saying she was ugly and all personal things like that. But I know she isn't, so.
You don't feel you're being hounded?
No. I mean, the amount of hounding we get, we're going to turn it into what we think is good use of it. If we're going to be hounded, we may as well say what we have to say about peace and things.
The United States was a hostile place in the late 60s into the early 70s. Huge public opposition was beginning to mount against the Vietnam War. Protests and rallies grew larger and louder, and the government was doing everything in its power to silence them. It wasn't until 1976, after years of testing legal battles, that Lennon was finally granted permanent residence in the United States.
Whether it's...
Violence begets violence, as far as I'm concerned. It's been proved by what's going on in the States and the protest marches in Grosvenor Square in London. The only result of that was a lot of smashed heads and front-page headlines about violence. And it wasn't the press's fault, nor the cops' fault, nor the minority left-wing students' fault, or whatever they're called, you know. It was just because the whole form they take doesn't work, you know. It doesn't work because that's what happens when you do that.
In his last recorded interview, he said what he liked about New York was the security, even the autograph hunters who only wanted a signature and then left him alone. And the man charged with Lennon's murder was an autograph hunter, Mark David Chapman, who, it's alleged in court this afternoon, came from Hawaii specially to kill Lennon.
Not surprising, then, that upon the outbreak of the news of Lennon's murder, a major conspiracy captivated much of the public, who believed that this was a politically motivated attempt to silence one of the loudest advocates for peace. The suspiciously similar circumstances of the assassination of JFK just a few years earlier in 1963 by another lonesome gunman left many with more questions than answers. Beneath the conspiracies, the reality was much more disturbing.
I think he's basically a schizophrenic who has, to a certain extent, lived in a fantasy world for many years.
So if Mark Chapman hadn't assassinated him, then perhaps somebody else would have at some point. And there are no doubt conspiracy theorists who would like to say that Mark Chapman was put up to the assassination of John Lennon by the FBI or the CIA. That is nonsense. Mark Chapman killed John Lennon because he was a sociopath, because of his own inadequacies and his own personal psychology. That's what drove that assassination. However, would somebody have had a go at John Lennon? I think probably yes. And he was aware of it too.
Mark Chapman was neurotic, malleable, and obsessive. He was the epitome of vague, fighting to assign himself any sort of meaning to his meaningless existence, but somehow still arrogant enough to believe that the world, or even an omnipotent God, had a great cosmic plan in place for him. Chapman was raised in Decatur, Georgia, and throughout turbulent years at high school, was a lifelong fan of the Beatles. He spent a troubled youth at the hands of his abusive father, in and out of school, running away from home, and succumbing to drug addiction. Chapman had overindulged during the summer of love, and as drug-induced liberation turned into reality-induced depression, he claims he was saved by Christianity. This became his new obsession. Now reinvigorated by a chance to start over in the eyes of his savior, he grew a characteristic disdain for his past, for the Beatles, and specifically, John Lennon. Not only did he feel betrayed by the promises of freedom and liberation from the hippie culture, he felt particular vitriol to Lennon for his ill-constructed remarks in 1966, "The Beatles are more popular than Jesus."
Maureen Cleave had interviewed John Lennon, and she was interviewing each Beatle for the Evening Standard, as I recall. And the Lennon one, he said, "We're more popular than Jesus. Christianity will vanish and grow. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity," which is absurd. You know, rock and roll is not even the popular music of the day anymore. Hip-hop is. And it's interesting to note that Danny Fields, who later managed the Ramones, was working at a superficial teenage pulp magazine called Date Book. And he got this interview because they would compete, these superficial teen magazines in America would compete to get a license to be the first American company to print interviews with the Beatles or whoever, the Rolling Stones. And he saw this Lennon interview, and his eyes bugged out with the quotes about Christianity will vanish and shrink. I don't know what's more popular now, the Beatles or rock and roll or Christianity. If the Beatles are more popular than Jesus. The young Danny Field's eyes bugged out. And he took those quotes and put them in Date Book in big bold-faced type. And this is months after the article had appeared in the UK. This is now, we're getting on to summer 1966. And boom, somebody saw it down south, and it was just match into a tin can full of kerosene. Boom. And this old, tired, 4-month-old quote was now the biggest news in America. And I remember the Beatle banning and the book burn and the Beatle record burning and the kerfuffle over Lennon saying they were more popular than Jesus. It was really something, really ugly. Even as a kid, I was worried because my mother was saying, we're not going to let you listen to the Beatles anymore. My dad came home from work, and I can see him now in the living room saying, that boy didn't mean it that way. Come on now, honey. And so, you know, that was the typical across America divide. One member of the family saying you can't have the Beatles in your life anymore, and someone else saying, now come on, be reasonable. It's a young kid full of juice shooting off his mouth. But it really was something when he said that. I mean, it really was something. It put a serious dent into their popularity in the United States.
December 8th, 1980, 7:30 a.m., New York City. John Lennon wakes up in his apartment in the Dakota. He had recently made a return to music and had renewed success in his latest album, Double Fantasy. "9 a.m. Lennon and his wife, Yoko Ono, finished their cafe breakfast on West 72nd Street and head back to the Dakota. Lennon has just had a brand new haircut and is feeling positive for his day ahead. 11 a.m. Photographer Annie Leibovitz arrives to photograph the married couple for the front cover of the magazine. As usual, Lennon controls the meeting, directing Annie to make sure his vision is correctly portrayed. The final photo produced depicts the intimate relationship of Lennon's love of his life, Yoko Ono. 1 p.m. John Lennon and Yoko Ono finish their photo shoot with Rolling Stone magazine and get ready for their interview with San Francisco radio producer Dave Sholin. Lennon sounds positive about his life. He talks about his new music, his love for New York, and his recent creative flow of ideas, eerily stating that he doesn't want to stop making music for a long time.
Because I always consider my work one piece, whether it be with Beatles, David Bowie, Elton John, Yoko Ono, and I consider that my work won't be finished until I'm dead and buried, and I hope that's a long, long time.
5 p.m. Lennon and Yoko Ono finish their radio interview and start heading to the record plant studio. A few minutes after they leave the Dakota, a quiet admirer waits outside their apartment and approaches Lennon. He hands Lennon his Double Fantasy record for a signature. Despite Lennon not being keen on confrontation by fans, he happily signs the record. Paul Goresh, a nearby loyal fan and photographer, takes a photo of this signing. After this fan encounter, Lennon returns the album and heads to the recording studio.
And there's that chilling photograph of John Lennon signing an autograph for Mark Chapman just a few hours before his death. And Chapman later said, even prayed maybe for somebody to stop him from killing John Lennon, but he couldn't stop.
5:40 p.m. John Lennon and Yoko Ono are recording their latest track, Walking on Thin Ice. Lennon seems happy during this session. His partnership with Yoko is everything he wants. The couple finalize their track, Lennon grabs the cassette of the final mix and takes it to their car as they leave for the Dakota. 10:45 p.m. John Lennon and Yoko Ono are on their way to the Dakota. Lennon couldn't be happier with their new recorded track. Their car turns onto West 72nd Street. The Dakota is in sight. 10:50 p.m., December 8th, 1980. John Lennon's limousine pulls up outside the Dakota. John Lennon steps out of the limousine. In 25 minutes, he will be pronounced dead.
They parked the limousine on the curb right outside the Dakota. There is a driveway into which they might have gone, but on this occasion did not.
The driver didn't get out, but Yoko opened the back door. She didn't wait for John. She walked past me. And John got out. I heard this voice, not an audible voice, but an inaudible voice saying over and over, "Do it, do it, do it, do it." I guess that was me inside. And I pulled the .38 revolver out of my pocket.
Behind him and called to him, "Mr. Lennon," as he arrived at that doorway, and then in a combat stance,
fired at his back 5 steady shots.
5 shots ring out. Mark Chapman describes it like this. He said, "A voice in my head was telling me," he said, "do it, do it, do it, do it." One after another, the shots ring out. 4 of them strike John Lennon in the back.
The way it shattered. The way it shattered. I heard Yoko, and I heard a woman screaming. It was Yoko. She was screaming, "Help me."
he went up the stairs. There are 5 steps that lead up into the watchman's area of the Dakota. He went through that area into an office inside, where he collapsed to the floor.
And when Lennon is lying, dying dead, Mark Chapman takes a book, Catcher in the Rye, and starts reading.
And at that point, for me, the movie stopped. I just stood there, just almost in a trance. The doorman, Jose, came over to me, and he had tears in his eyes. And he said, "Do you know what you've done? Do you know what you've done?" And the tears are streaming down his face. And he said, "Get out of here." He says, "Please, please, just leave. Please get out of here." And I looked at him, and I said, "But where would I go?" I liked John Lennon at one point myself, before this thought of murder came inside myself. I would be very angry at anybody who did anything to him, so I can understand their anger. It's very difficult being who I am. I have to face what I've done every day. That's not easy. And I imagine this will go on until I die. I can face it now. I can look at what I did from a rational perspective, from even another perspective of, kind of placing myself back at that time and trying to analyze what I did, which I'm still undergoing, I used to love the Beatles and go along with anything they said. Their idealism meant a lot to me. And I saw that at that time as a sellout. I was just letting loose this tirade of, just an explosive anger at John Lennon.
Christianity gave Chapman unchecked validation, belonging, and purpose. He committed to extensive work with the YMCA as a Bible camp counselor. earned great praise for his commitment to the holy text, and was even nicknamed the Pied Piper after his incredible relationship with the camp-going children.
One of the explanations Mark Chapman has given for his behavior, he says, I wasn't listening to God. He says he's been a Christian since he was 16 years of age, and on the day I killed John Lennon, I wasn't listening to God. But what's interesting is that the scale of his narcissism, if you want, his grandiosity. He used an incredible phrase. He says, God, he says, has a tender spot in his heart. A tender spot in his heart. Those are Mark Chapman's words. A tender spot in his heart for prisoners like me. So he thinks God will forgive me, yeah? Because God understands I'm a flawed, free human being. And he is certain that God has forgiven him. He will find his way back to God. So what greater absolution is there for a cold-hearted killer like Mark Chapman than to have the belief, the naive belief in his mind, that the supreme being, the creator of the universe, has a tender spot in his heart for Mark Chapman. That is the measure, not only of the man's stupidity, but also of his grandiosity, and also of the impossibility of changing his psychology.
I turned to Satan because I knew I wouldn't have the strength to kill a man on my own. So I went through what I thought was an appropriate satanic ritual, and took all my clothes off and chanted and screamed and howled. And
before the murder?
Yes. I asked Satan to give me the power to kill John Lennon.
His religion was his world. But just like his other bygone obsessions, the latest one would eventually sour. Instead, he found solace in a new obsession, one that would eventually leave John Lennon dead and Chapman behind bars for life. Published in 1951, J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye became a staple of modern American literature. It is an uncomplicated critique on the superficiality of society. And for Mark Chapman, it became his Bible. Chapman latched onto the novel's protagonist, Holden Caulfield, and began to believe that he was the personification of the fictional character, the purveyor of righteousness, protector against the phony. In his last few days as a camp counselor, he would talk about The Catcher in the Rye endlessly. He was completely disillusioned from reality. Holden Caulfield was his new reality. But from this point on, he became severely depressed. In 1977, he fled from his life. He ran away to Hawaii in an attempt to start over, recover from the depths of depression. But he couldn't. On a hot summer's afternoon in June 1977, he drove to a secluded spot, rigged the exhaust, and tried to kill himself. But he couldn't. In 1978, Mark met Gloria Abe, with whom he would be wed just 1 year later. Despite the romance, his obsession with that fateful novel and his burdening depression would still haunt him. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, John Lennon lived a reclusive life. After the Beatles' fame, he wanted nothing more than a quiet life with his new son and his wife. The activist and revolutionary had become the everyman. This is what Chapman latched onto. For him, Lennon was the antithesis of everything Holden Caulfield stood for, and Chapman was Holden Caulfield. On October 23, 1980, Mark Chapman quit his job and signed John Lennon on his final timesheet. In November, he traveled to New York City. He wanted to murder Lennon then, but he couldn't. Whether it was guilt, doubt, or the lack of opportunity, either way, the madman ran away, as he had most of his life and problems. A coward who sought to blame a world that, in his own self-indulgent way, he swore was working against him. He spent a few weeks in Atlanta, Georgia. He bought bullets and practiced his marksmanship, rebuilding his own twisted self-confidence. Then, on December 6th, he returned to New York City. Within minutes of the news, crowds of fans gather outside the Dakota to pay their respects. His message of equality and peace had affected the lives of millions.
The body has been taken over town across to East 30th Street to the medical examiner's office. And the medical examiner's office told the BBC this morning that 4 bullets were in fact shot into John Lennon, one of which went through the body, one of which remained. It's thought that he died almost instantly.
He shot 5 times. It might have been 3, it might have been 6, it might have been 7. He obviously felt 5 was enough. We don't know which of the 4 bullets that entered John Lennon's body killed him. But what we do know is how bullets kill people. I mean, and the phrase is cavitation, that literally a bullet makes a hole in a body. It creates a hole. So if you're going to survive a gunshot, I guess the best hope you've got is the bullet passes through you. If the bullet hits a bone or shatters inside the body, then the bullet breaks into cascades into smaller little pellets and causes damage all around the body. A bullet doesn't just go in whole and stop whole. If it comes up against an obstruction, it will fragment, and it causes devastation in the body. So just because you shot 4 times doesn't mean you die. But in John Lennon's case, it did. And we'll never know, perhaps, which of the shots killed him.
You're the only one that keeps me satisfied. Oh, oh, oh. You're the only love that makes the world seem right, the world seem right.
John Lennon's death has shocked people all over the world. Yugoslav radio played many of his records today. East German radio paid tribute to him for his anti-war work. His fellow Beatles were in a state of shock. Paul McCartney said today that he can't yet take in the news. He said, "John was a great guy who'll be missed by the whole world." George Harrison was tonight said to be stunned. He said that after all we went through together, I had and still have great respect for him. All over the pop world, the reaction was one of complete despair. Mick Jagger, speaking from Paris, claimed that he was shattered by the news.
He's not dead. They're just saying that.
You know, the doctor just announced it?
Yes, but I don't care. They're just saying that to get people to leave. He's not dead. John Lennon can't be dead.
Froze me. I came last night for basically my own reasons to show support for whatever. It wasn't really morbid curiosity. This morning, I think I was here curious to see how everyone else reacted.
Symbolized hope, a new life, a new beginning. He was a great man.
Paul McCartney came in for some criticism, after the assassination of John Lennon, because they were believed to be at loggerheads. They'd fallen out, and his demeanor seemed to be quite nonchalant. Apparently, when he was asked about John Lennon's death, he was chewing gum, and he didn't seem to be emotionally engaged.
What time did you hear the news? This morning sometime. Very early? Yeah. Don't know, yeah? Drag, isn't it? Okay, cheers. Bye-bye. Let's go.
But let's just pause for a moment. This is a man who grew up together. They knew each other as kids. They'd gone from the back streets of Liverpool to the heights of Hollywood celebrity and fame and a global brand, the like of which we might never see again. They were a phenomenon, by far and away the most influential band of the 20th century. And he is having to contemplate and face the death not only of his collaborator, but also of his friend. And he didn't know how to react. Maybe he was in shock. One thing we have to do is give McCartney the benefit of the doubt, because what was interesting is in the recent rallies against guns in the United States, McCartney marched with the students. And he said, my best friend, he said, or one of my best friends was killed by a lunatic with a gun. So he is now putting his name to a campaign against guns. And I suggest that in spite of whatever differences and difficulties they had, the bond between Lennon and McCartney was a strong one.
The murder of John Lennon in New York last night is full of ironies. He just started a successful musical comeback after years of withdrawal. In his last recorded interview, he said what he liked about New York was the security, even the autograph hunters who only wanted a signature and then left him alone. And the man charged with Lennon's murder was an autograph hunter, Mark David Chapman, who, it's alleged in court this afternoon, came from Hawaii specially to kill Lennon.
Under heavy guard, Mark Chapman was brought from prison to the state Supreme Court in Manhattan to hear the judge's sentence. Chapman showed no emotion whatsoever when the sentence of 20 years to life was handed out. But before that moment, there was to be detailed evidence about his state of mind. In his evidence, Dr. Schwartz said that at first Chapman had idolized the pop star and had started to believe he was John Lennon. But realizing he was losing his own identity, Chapman's adulation turned to hate. Lennon became an evil person he had to kill.
What's extraordinary about Mark Chapman is how he got his identity completely confused with that of John Lennon. On his last day at work, he signed himself out as John Lennon. He was quoted as saying he was obsessed with killing John Lennon. Simply so, in his words, I could be somebody, he said. I could be somebody. Or another phrase he used was, so I could acquire his fame. And there's a chilling photograph of John Lennon signing an autograph from Mark Chapman just a few hours before his death. And Chapman later said, you know, even prayed maybe for somebody to stop him from killing John Lennon, but he couldn't stop.
John Lennon fell into a very deep hole, a hole that was so deep inside of me that I thought by killing him, I would acquire his fame.
He had also fantasized, before killing John Lennon, he'd fantasized of detonating a nuclear bomb, of killing thousands, millions of people. And what is chilling is Eric Harris, who was one of the Columbine killers, the Columbine school killers, he also fantasized. He said, the human race isn't worth preserving, he said. It's got to go. We've got to get rid of it all. And these fantasies of destroying everything so that these people who live in what can only be described as a psychological pit of inadequacy and emotional dysfunction and sociopathic behaviors can only find meaning through killing, through fantasies of killing, and through then taking those fantasies into reality.
Today, Chapman's lawyer, who originally had wanted him to plead not guilty because of insanity, unsuccessfully applied to have the guilty plea reversed. Then, a leading psychiatrist, Dr. Daniel Schwartz, was called to the witness box, and he described Chapman as a paranoid schizophrenic.
I think he's basically a schizophrenic who has, to a certain extent, lived in a fantasy world for many years, who has also suffered from severe depressions, and who committed this awful act for many reasons, not the least of which was, without him quite being aware of it, an attempt to cope with his feelings of depression and suicide.
There he is. So I went up to him and I took out my album, and I found the words, and I said, John, would you sign my album?
Where did he sign?
Right on Yoko's neck. What did you write? He wrote John Lennon, 1980, after it got dark.
One of the explanations Mark Chapman has given for his behavior, he says, I wasn't listening to God. He says he's been a Christian since he was 16 years of age. And on the day I killed John Lennon, I wasn't listening to God.
I turned to Satan because I knew I wouldn't have the strength to kill a man on my own. So I went through what I thought was an appropriate satanic ritual, took all my clothes off and chanted and screamed and howled, and I asked Satan to give me the power to kill John Lennon.
Well, what's interesting is that the scale of his narcissism, if you want, his grandiosity. He used an incredible phrase. He says, God, he says, has a tender spot in his heart. A tender spot in his heart. Those are Mark Chapman's words. A tender spot in his heart for prisoners like me. So he thinks God will forgive me, yeah? Because God understands I'm a flawed, free human being. And he is certain that God has forgiven him. He will find his way back to God. So what greater absolution is there for a cold-hearted killer like Mark Chapman than to have the belief, the naive belief in his mind, that the supreme being, the creator of the universe, has a tender spot in his heart for Mark Chapman. That is the measure, not only of the man's stupidity, but also of his grandiosity, and also of the impossibility of changing his psychology.
I liked John Lennon at one point myself, before this thought of murder came inside myself. I would be very angry at anybody who did anything to him, so I can understand their anger. It's very difficult being who I am. I have to face what I've done every day. That's not easy. And I imagine this will go on until I die. I can face it now. I can look at what I did from a rational perspective, from even another perspective of, you know, kind of placing myself back at that time and trying to analyze what I did, which I'm still undergoing, you know.
So what you have here in Mark Chapman is somebody who is a cold, clinical, and ruthless killer. Now, there's a debate whether he was a sociopath or whether he was a psychopath. Now, the difference between a sociopath and psychopath is simply a matter of degree. The simplest way to put it is sociopaths share the same narcissism, the same grandiosity, the same lack of empathy as psychopaths, except on occasion, particularly with those they are close to, they are capable of some empathy. And they can lose the balance of their mind. Perhaps because of that empathy, they can feel some emotional engagement with people in a way that a psychopath can't. Chapman's assassination of Lennon, at the very least, was the act of a sociopath. And the fact that he identified so strongly with Holden Caulfield, the hero of Catcher in the Rye, the naive, rebellious teenager who thinks the whole world is phony and is looking for his place in the world, well, that's what Chapman was doing. And he wasn't looking for any place in the world. He was looking for John Lennon's place in the world. And there wasn't room in the world for both Mark Chapman and John Lennon. One of them had to go. And as Chapman himself said, after killing John Lennon, I've thought about suicide, but I was never courageous enough to do it. So he wasn't courageous enough to take his own life. So if there was only room for either Mark Chapman or John Lennon in the world, Mark Chapman decided it was John Lennon who had to leave. Mark Chapman will never change. Mark Chapman will always be a killer, and he'll always be capable of killing. And there are many men who verge on, who have lack of empathy and who verge on sociopathic tendencies, who might fantasize about all sorts of acts of violence, but they might have enough empathy, enough connection to their fellow human beings to stop them from doing that. But when you become sociopathic, when you are dealing with a sociopath, this behavior is notoriously difficult to change. The safest place for the potential future victims of Mark Chapman is for Mark Chapman to be behind bars.
It's now 14 hours since John Lennon was shot here at the entrance to the Dakota building on West 72nd Street in the center of New York. And in those 14 hours, there's been a crowd here standing in more or less silent vigil, and the flowers have been piling up at the gate.
He was one of our originals. There'll never be another person like him again.
John Lennon certainly was somebody who has made a difference to the world. His philosophy of love, of peace and of understanding is a universal message which today is as important as it was at his time.
I just think he was such an amazing songwriter, such an amazing human being. He really used his art and his craft to try and really make a difference in the world. And I think, you know, when you have that privilege of people loving you and loving, you know, what you say and listening, you know, it's important what you say and what you put out there. And I think he did so many incredible things that that do still resonate, and so yeah, that's why I think people just still think so highly of him.
He really wrote a biography of his life in music, and I don't know whether he did it intentionally or how it came about, but he has written his life biographically in all the songs he did.
He's writing songs that, you know, I feel like inspire peace and inspire revolutions. So for me, it's kind of like it's an honor to, you know, be here. I feel like I want to make the same kind of impact, you know, like give people a feeling or some kind of energy when they hear my music. So yeah.
John Lennon's Imagine was one that truly spoke to me at a young, early age, and the message of hope that it relays. And he, you know, he was a true genius songwriter that, you know, lives on through the ages.
If he'd have lived, I think that down the line some young buck or a Springsteen or a John Fogerty would have grabbed him and they made a great rock and roll album. I would say my three favorite John Lennon solo songs are Crippled Inside, which is just a brilliant piece of rockabilly work that informs the listener, if they want to pay attention, of the turmoil inside the spirit of the great John Lennon. I also like Cold Turkey from 1969. And a third song I like is at the end of his life, he released Double Fantasy, and on it, the first song on it, that Elvis, it's almost an Elvis, starting over, it's almost an Elvis tribute. It's just so John Lennon, because it's 1950s, his era, which he confessed to many times, updated into the present day, 1980 for then. And people think of him as a 60s guy. To his dying breath, he was a 1950s guy in terms of popular music, popular culture. And I think those are the three: Cold Turkey, Crippled Inside, and Starting Over. They're just great. Almost, you can't criticize them.
Ladies and gentlemen, we proudly welcome to the Walk of Fame Mr. John Lennon. Yeah!
The sad reality of it all is that there was no complex motive, no cause, no rhyme or reason. John Lennon just had the grave misfortune of fame. The grave misfortune of becoming a face a madman could recognize, and the grave misfortune of becoming the obsession of a self-serving hypocrite. And it cost him everything. He tried to live out the fictional details of The Catcher in the Rye, the book he had tried to structure his disastrous life into the image of. December 8th, 1980, 10:30 a.m. Mark Chapman woke up late. He was staying at the Sheridan Center in Midtown Manhattan. He got dressed, unpacked his .38 caliber revolver, and ritualistically set out his belongings on the dresser. A Bible, a passport, and a photograph from The Wizard of Oz. On his way to the Dakota, he bought a copy of The Catcher in the Rye and signed it to Holden Caulfield from Holden Caulfield. This is my statement.
It was a very long day. It was overcast. And I had been standing outside the Dakota for many hours, talking to the people that were there. All of a sudden, John Lennon comes out. I had bought Double Fantasy.
You bought this album that was very popular at that time.
Yes, it was. Paul kind of pushed me forward and said, there he is. So I went up to him and I stuck out my album. And I found the words and I said, John, would you sign my album?
Where did he sign?
Right on Yoko's neck.
What did you write?
He wrote John Lennon, 1980. After it got dark, the hours went by, 2, 3, 4 hours, 5 hours. I had the gun in my pocket. And I had a copy of The Catcher in the Rye over the gun. So I'm sitting there. It's dark. And this limo pulls up. The driver didn't get out, but Yoko opened the back door. She didn't wait for John. She walked past me. And John got out. And he came up the pathway. And he looked at me also. I heard this voice. Not an audible voice, but an inaudible voice saying over and over, do it, do it, do it, do it. I guess that was me inside. And I pulled the .38 revolver out of my pocket. I went into what's called a combat stance. I pulled the gun up. I used my left hand to buttress the gun underneath. And I fired at his back 5 steady shots. And at that point, for me, the movie stopped. 2 officers were holding John Lennon's body. And I remember the look on the officer's face and what he was mouthing, although I couldn't hear him, the one that was holding his head and his shoulders. And he was just violently cursing me. It was a horrible thing to see. And it frightened me to death. Here's this police officer, and he's just mouthing these horrible words at me. And I sat there for maybe another minute or so, and over in the corner of my eye, I see this figure come up to the window. It was Yoko, and she'd come over to the window of the patrol car, and she looked in, and I looked at her, and I'm devastated by her look. She just wanted to know who's this horrible monster that has killed John Lennon, my husband, and I want to see this rat, I want to see this creep. And I'm looking at her, and I just utterly ashamed. A big coward. I turn away, and I can't even face her.
Whereas the fixation of Mark Chapman was on John Lennon, he had also fantasized, before killing John Lennon, he'd fantasized of detonating a nuclear bomb, of killing thousands, millions of people. And what is chilling is Eric Harris, who was one of the Columbine killers, the Columbine school killers. He also fantasized. He said, the human race isn't worth preserving, he said. It's got to go. We've got to get rid of it all. And these fantasies of destroying everything so that these people who live in what can only be described as a psychological pit of inadequacy and emotional dysfunction and sociopathic behaviors can only find meaning through killing, through fantasies of killing, and through then taking those fantasies into reality. Which is why Mark Chapman will never get released on parole, nor should he ever get released on parole. Because irrespective of how many times he tries, and I'm not sure how many times it is, 9, 10, 11, how many he's gone through at this stage, he will keep going for parole. But he's playing. He's playing. And he has a complete lack of empathy, and he is a danger to himself, but above all, he is a danger to others. And there's a terrifying anecdote of a fellow prisoner who he sent almost crazy by using calm, hypnotic, sociopathic behaviors and language to convince the guy that there were some terrible snakes underneath his bed. And that's the power of the man. All he wants is power over others, precisely because he has no power himself. And if you imagine the difference in stature between John Lennon, one of the most iconic figures of the 20th century, and Mark Chapman, one of the most ludicrously inadequate figures of the 20th century, okay? So his inadequacy was in direct proportion to the power and stature of the man he killed. It was that much power he wanted, because it was that much power that he lacked. That was the depth of the hole in his life, in his emotional life, and he had to kill to try and get it. But of course he can't get it, because he'd have to kill again and again and again. And if it wasn't Lennon, it would be somebody else, because that kind of hole can never possibly be filled. That's why the fantasies of nuclear destruction are equally befitting that kind of psychology. There is no end to the killing.
This is a simple man who found solace in his own bewilderment at something symbolic that he had overcomplicated and romanticized. He is plainly an idiot and a fool who fell over his metaphorical cliff, first to drugs, then to religion, and then to Catcher in the Rye, but ultimately to his own ego. This all ended on a cold, dark winter's night on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, New York City, when one man made a fateful decision that changed the world forever.